This is the story of how the most infamous horror franchise in gaming transformed from a simple haunted pizzeria into a labyrinth of contradictions that even its most dedicated fans can't fully untangle. We're talking about Five Nights at Freddy's, and after more than a dozen games, multiple books, and a decade of lore hunting, the question isn't what is the FNAF lore, it's what even is the FNAF lore anymore. Hey guys, Horror Lorekeeper here. If you've been following this franchise since the beginning, you've watched Scott Cawthon and Steel Wool Studios systematically demolish every theory you thought was solid. You've seen fan-favorite explanations get retroactively invalidated. You've watched new games arrive, not to answer questions, but to make you question the answers you already had. And now, after Secret of the Mimic, we're watching the Fallout rewrite what we thought we knew about Edwin Murray and the origins of the entire nightmare. But here's what makes FNAF's lore situation so uniquely frustrating and fascinating. This isn't accidental. This is a horror franchise that has weaponized uncertainty itself. Scott Cawthon didn't just create haunted animatronics. He created a mystery box that gets bigger every time you think you've solved it. If you like FNAF deep dives that use real psychology to explain why these mysteries hijack your brain, hit subscribe. Let me take you through exactly how we got here, why the lore feels impossible to pin down, and what that tells us about horror storytelling in the digital age. Back in 2014, FNAF was elegantly simple. You're a night guard. Animatronics want to stuff you in a suit. There's a killer on the loose. Phone guy delivers exposition with lines like, they'll probably try to forcefully stuff you inside a Freddy Fazbear suit. And that was honestly all the context you needed to be terrified. FNAF 1 established the core horror, malfunctioning mascots, dead children, corporate negligence, classic urban legend material wrapped in jump scare mechanics. The lore was a garnish, not the main course. FNAF 2 complicated things in productive ways. The prequel structure meant the bite of 87 became a timeline anchor. We got more phone guy lore, more animatronic varieties, more evidence of systematic cover-ups. But the fundamental logic held. Bad things happened at Freddy's. Ghosts are angry. Corporations lie to protect profits. FNAF 3 should have been the ending. The 30 years later marketing made it clear. This was the aftermath story. Springtrap emerges from decades of containment. Fazbear's fright burns down. And the implication was that the nightmare finally ended with the fire. Clean narrative arc, setup, escalation, resolution. But that clean resolution lasted exactly 2 years before FNAF 4 detonated the timeline. FNAF 4 introduced the bite of 83, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore. If there was a bite in 1983 and a bite in 1987, which bite was the phone guy talking about? If FNAF 4 was a prequel to everything, why did it look like a sequel? Were we playing as a child having nightmares, or an adult remembering trauma, or something else entirely? This is where you can see the franchise's relationship with certainty fundamentally change. FNAF 1 through 3 rewarded careful observation and logical deduction. FNAF 4 punished those same skills by making every confident theory suddenly uncertain. The community adapted by developing more complex analytical frameworks. Timeline theorists emerged. Character identity became a puzzle requiring cross-game evidence. The lore went from being a simple haunted pizzeria story to requiring active investigation just to follow basic plot threads. But FNAF 4's timeline shock was nothing compared to what Sister Location did to the franchise's DNA. Sister Location transformed FNAF from supernatural horror to science fiction horror, and the lore implications were massive. Instead of haunted pizzerias, we got underground facilities. Instead of simple possession, we got advanced robotics with capture and containment protocols. Instead of phone guys' folksy warnings, we got clinical facility announcements and technical specifications. Most importantly, Sister Location introduced the idea that someone was systematically engineering these horrors. The animatronics weren't just possessed, they were designed for specific purposes. The facilities weren't just restaurants, they were research sites. The whole operation was bigger, more coordinated, more intentional than anyone realized. This is also where Michael Afton became central to fan theories, though the games themselves kept his identity deliberately ambiguous. The community consensus treats him as the protagonist of Sister Location, but that's inference based on voice acting, circumstantial evidence, and process of elimination. The game never directly confirms it. And that ambiguity was intentional. Sister Location marked the beginning of FNAF's shift toward requiring community interpretation to understand basic plot elements. The lore wasn't just mysterious, it was requiring collaborative detective work to even establish who you were playing as. Pizzeria Simulator felt like salvation for fans desperate for narrative closure. Henry's monologue and the true ending provided exactly what the community had been craving: direct exposition, clear motivations, explicit consequences. William Afton, Michael Afton, Henry Emily, Charlie Emily, the family tragedy was finally laid bare, and everyone burned together in a fire designed to end the cycle permanently. For about 2 years, this worked. Pizzeria Simulator plus Ultimate Custom Night felt like a complete story. The killer was punished, the victims were freed, the corporate cover-up machine was finally stopped. You could point to specific characters, specific relationships, specific resolutions, but that satisfaction was a trap. Scott Cawthon had created the perfect ending specifically so he could break it. Help Wanted didn't just continue the FNAF story, it retroactively contaminated everything that came before by introducing the idea that Fazbear Entertainment had been commissioning indie games to make light of their past troubles. The franchise suddenly included multiple layers of reality. Were the previous games real events? Or were they sanitized retellings of real events? Or were they complete fabrications designed to make real horrors seem fictional? The meta premise created permanent uncertainty about what actually happened versus what was being presented as having happened. And then there was the Glitch Trap entity, a digital presence that could manipulate both virtual environments and human consciousness. Vanessa's split identity as Vanny represented the franchise's new horror paradigm. Not just haunted objects, but corrupted systems. Not just dead children seeking revenge, but malevolent intelligence that could rewrite personality itself. The lore wasn't just complex anymore. It was potentially unreliable. Every previous game might be a lie. Every confident interpretation might be based on corrupted information. Security Breach should have simplified things by focusing on Gregory and Vanessa in a single location with clear objectives. Instead, it created more questions than any previous entry. The Pizzaplex itself was a paradox. How could this massive entertainment complex exist in the same universe where Fazbear Entertainment was supposedly defunct? How could the company rebuild on this scale after the exposures and fires and scandals? Why would anyone bring their children to a Freddy Fazbear location after everything that had supposedly happened? The game's technical state at launch meant crucial lore elements were either cut, buggy, or relegated to optional content. The true ending required specific combinations of exploration and completion that many players never discovered. Key character relationships were implied rather than explicit. Most frustratingly, Security Breach introduced major new concepts: the burn trap entity, Freddy's protective behavior, Vanessa's complex psychological state, without adequate explanation of how they connected to established lore. Ruin, released July 25th, 2023, finally clarified Security Breach's lore chaos, but the answers it provided fundamentally changed how FNAF storytelling works. The Mimic entity wasn't just another antagonist, it was a deception engine. It could perfectly replicate voices, manipulate digital environments, and orchestrate elaborate lies to achieve its goals. Playing as Cassie, you experienced this manipulation firsthand as the Mimic used Gregory's voice to guide you through the ruined Pizzaplex. But Ruin's real innovation was making deception itself a central horror theme. You couldn't trust what you heard, you couldn't trust what you saw, you couldn't even trust your own previous knowledge of the franchise, because the Mimic might have been manipulating events for longer than anyone realized. This retroactively recontextualized every previous game. How much of what we thought we knew was actually Mimic manipulation? How long had this entity been active? Were there other deception engines? Was the entire franchise history potentially compromised? Help Wanted 2 launched in VR on December 14th, 2023, then arrived in flat mode on June 20th, 2024, and its lore implications are still being decoded. The game positions itself as another Fazbear Entertainment product, but now we know these innocent games can harbor dangerous entities. The training scenarios and minigames seem designed to test specific skills: observation, problem solving, stress management under pressure. But training for what? And why would Fazbear Entertainment need to train people for scenarios that officially never happened? The game also explores Vanessa's psychological recovery, suggesting that Vanny's influence can be overcome but not easily erased. The identity split theme continues, but now with the possibility of healing and reintegration. Most intriguingly, Help Wanted 2 suggests that the VR horror experiences might be serving a dual purpose: entertainment for consumers, but also psychological conditioning for specific individuals. The franchise has always been about manipulation, but now that manipulation is explicitly targeting the player. Secret of the Mimic released on June 13th, 2025, and the official Epic Games Store description revealed a crucial detail. Edwin Murray, described as the reclusive inventor connected to Murray's costume manor. This is the first time the franchise has explicitly positioned a game around uncovering an inventor's backstory. For over a decade of games, we've been dealing with the consequences of someone's creations. Now we're finally gonna see the creation process itself. The timing is significant. After Ruin established the Mimic as a master manipulator capable of long-term deception, Secret of the Mimic promises to show us how that deception engine was built. Edwin Murray isn't just another character, he's potentially the architect of the franchise's current reality. But here's what makes this particularly fascinating. Murray's costume manner suggests a connection to the original Freddy Fazbear aesthetic, but filtered through an individual inventor rather than a corporate entity. This could be the missing link between the supernatural horror of the original games and the technological horror of the modern era. What makes FNAF's lore situation so uniquely effective as horror is how it weaponizes our pattern-seeking instincts. Humans are desperate to find meaning in chaos, to construct coherent narratives from fragmentary evidence. FNAF provides just enough connectivity to make theories feel viable, then systematically undermines those theories to create cognitive dissonance. This isn't accidental frustration, it's engineered uncertainty. Every time fans develop confident interpretations, new information arrives to destabilize those interpretations. The horror isn't just in the jump scares or the gore, it's in the gradual realization that you can't trust your own analytical abilities. Consider how this affects the fan community. FNAF theorists aren't just analyzing fictional events, they're constantly adapting to having their analytical frameworks invalidated. The most successful FNAF content creators are those who've learned to embrace uncertainty rather than seeking definitive answers. This creates a unique relationship between audience and text. Other franchises reward deep knowledge with insider status and predictive accuracy. FNAF rewards deep knowledge with increasing awareness of how much you don't know. There's another level of horror operating in FNAF's lore structure that often gets overlooked: the corporate rehabilitation machine. Fazbear Entertainment, as portrayed across the games, is a company that specializes in making atrocities seem harmless. They rebrand, they relocate, they commission sanitized retellings of their own crimes. They turn genuine horror into marketable entertainment. But here's the meta-horror. This is exactly what the FNAF franchise itself does. Scott Cawthon and Steelwool Studios have created a horror property that makes serial murder and child death into consumable entertainment. The in-universe corporate cover-ups mirror the real-world process of turning trauma into profit. The franchise constantly draws attention to this parallel. The indie games within Help Wanted, the Fazbear Entertainment products, the VR training systems, they all represent different methods of packaging horror for mass consumption. This creates a layer of complicity that most horror franchises avoid. When you engage with FNAF lore, you're not just analyzing fictional atrocities, you're participating in the same system that the games criticize. You're consuming trauma as entertainment, while critiquing the consumption of trauma as entertainment. The most common fan complaint about modern FNAF is that the lore has become too complicated or impossible to follow. The implicit assumption is that this is a problem that could be solved with better exposition or cleaner continuity, but that misunderstands what the franchise has become. FNAF's lore isn't broken, it's operating exactly as intended. The confusion isn't a bug, it's the feature. The franchise has evolved into a horror story about horror storytelling. The Mimic entity represents the ultimate expression of this theme, a system that can perfectly replicate any narrative but has no authentic identity of its own. It's a perfect metaphor for how franchise horror works, endlessly recycling and recombining elements to create the appearance of novelty while avoiding genuine innovation. The lore can't be fixed because the lore is about being unable to trust the information you're receiving. Any attempt to provide definitive answers would undermine the core theme of systematic deception and corporate manipulation. With Five Nights at Freddy's 2 now already out, it hit theaters on December 5th, 2025, and even rolled into digital purchase/rental later that month. We've already crossed the inflection point where the franchise has two major story engines running at once. The games pushing forward and the movies rewriting the same universe for a wider audience. And here's the part that keeps the meta horror alive. Movies can't survive on the same endless fog that games can. They need clean protagonists, clearer cause and effect, and endings that actually land, so they're forced to choose versions of events. But inside FNAF's own framework, that choice can still feel like another Fazbear Entertainment move. A polished retelling that sanitizes, simplifies, and sells the nightmare back to the public. The Edwin Murray revelation suggests the franchise is moving toward origin stories and inventor psychology. Instead of just dealing with haunted animatronics, we might finally see how someone could design systems specifically meant to harm children. But knowing Scott Cawthon's approach to lore development, even these origin stories will likely create more questions than they answer. Edwin Murray might explain how the Mimic was built, but that explanation will probably reveal deeper mysteries about why it was built and who really wanted it to exist. What makes FNAF's lore truly effective as horror isn't the jump scares or the gore, or even the child murder. It's the gradual realization that you're trapped in a system designed to prevent you from ever understanding what's actually happening. Every new game promises answers but delivers more questions. Every confident theory gets undermined by new evidence. Every attempt to construct a coherent timeline gets sabotaged by retcons and recontextualizations. The real horror is the recognition that this might be intentional, not just as a storytelling strategy, but as a representation of how power structures actually operate. Corporations hide their crimes behind layers of rebranding and misdirection. Authorities provide explanations that don't quite explain anything. Systems exist to perpetuate themselves rather than serve their stated purposes. FNAF has become a horror franchise about living in a world where the people in charge are systematically preventing you from understanding what they've done and why they did it. The lore isn't confusing because Scott Cawthon is bad at storytelling. It's confusing because confusion is the point, and that's what makes it so terrifying. When Secret of the Mimic launched in June 2025, we didn't get the missing piece the way people expected. We got a new lens. The franchise finally pushed us closer to the inventor/origin side of the nightmare. But in classic FNAF fashion, every answer came bundled with new doubts about what was engineered, what was supernatural, and how long the story has been steering us on purpose. Because in the world of FNAF, the real monsters aren't the animatronics trying to stuff you into a suit. The real monsters are the systems designed to make sure you never figure out who built the animatronics, why they built them, and how many other horrors they've hidden behind layers of corporate rebranding and manufactured nostalgia. The lore isn't broken, the lore is about being broken, and that's exactly why it works. If FNAF has taught us anything, it's that the scariest part isn't the animatronics, it's what uncertainty does to your brain when you stare at it long enough. If you want lore that doesn't just tell you what happened, but explains why you can't stop thinking about it, subscribe. We hit 500, now we're hunting 1,000. I've been the horror Lorekeeper, and remember, sometimes the monster isn't in the dark, it's in the pattern you swear you see. See you in the next tape.